what Mr. Bhuta also discussed, that the manner of incorporation of the entity offshore, apart from the control test, is that it should be a limited liability company. Now, this limited liability company exception is only where an entity is engaged in a strategic sector like energy, natural resources, in which case it can be an unincorporated company also. Key requirements for making an ODI today. So what we discussed in the last presentation was that there is a requirement for an entity to be engaged in a bona fide business activity. Bona fide business activity is any activity which Indian entity, Indian jurisdiction and the host jurisdiction of the offshore entity recognizes as a bona fide activity. So that effectively means that you can't really incorporate an SPV offshore. So if an Indian entity wants to leverage funds from an offshore lender, then it can't be done via an SPV. It has to incorporate an OpCo. I'll take a case study here. We were advising a client. It was a US-based client which wanted to acquire Indian operating entities, leveraging the assets of Indian operating entities, but the Indian entities did not have any presence offshore. So what we did was, the structuring that we did there was that we made the Indian entity incorporate an offshore entity. Now, of course, the offshore entity did not really have any operations to show. So in that case, then we made the offshore entity incorporated as a financial services company, in the sense that its only objective was to give loans. So we said, how do you classify that as a financial services company? Now, when you come to Indian law, NBFCs are basically, if you meet the 50-50 test on an NBFC. So similarly for that SPV, we said that the only business it takes is effectively giving of loans, which is a bona fide business activity as per Indian law, and therefore it is a bona fide business activity even as per US law. So that was one structuring call that we had taken to ensure that the ODI investment that we were making for the purpose of acquisition of an Indian entity was compliant with the ODI rules. I've put on the slide some of the straight out restrictions under the ODI regulations. So ODI will not be permitted in a real estate activity, it will not be permitted in gambling, and it will not be permitted in dealing with financial products. Real estate activity was again covered by Mr. Sunil, so I'm going to skip over that. So one another key change which has been made in the ODI regulations this time is that they clearly specify what kind of entity can engage in a financial services activity offshore. So an Indian entity which is not engaged in a financial services activity must have posted profits for the preceding 3 financial years, and it can engage, and therefore only then it can engage, set up an ODI which is engaged in a financial services activity. The example which I just gave there, our Indian entity was posting profits, so it was easy for us to actually incorporate an SPV with a very small business percentage of an intercorporate loan shown to show that this is an NBFC for the purposes of Indian law, and therefore also for the purposes of offshore law. But you can't set up, you can't have an ODI in any entity which is engaged in banking or insurance if the Indian entity itself is not engaged in financial services activity. If the Indian entity itself is engaged in financial services activity, then also it must have posted net profits for the preceding 3 financial years. It should be registered as a financial services entity in India, regulated either by SEBI or by RBI. So it could be a bank, or it could be an insurance company which is regulated by SEBI, or a mutual fund which is regulated by SEBI. Of course, the Indian entity will have to obtain the relevant approval. It's an offshore investment of a financial services, so the relevant approvals from RBI, SEBI, IRDAI, whatever it is, will need to be obtained before making that ODI. Okay, so this actually is the key aspect that we need to discuss now, where if you see in this presentation, what we have shown is Indian parent has a foreign entity offshore. Of course, ODI means it has minimum 10% control. The foreign entity can have a step-down subsidiary 1. It can also have a step-down subsidiary 2. We've discussed this in detail. But it should have minimum 10% in step-down subsidiary 1. And what is not shown in this slide is step-down subsidiary 2, in which also it should have 10%. If the Indian parent, now for any loan availed by the foreign entity, or by the step-down subsidiary 1, or what is not shown in the slide, step-down subsidiary 2, by a global overseas lender, Indian parent can issue a guarantee to that global overseas lender. Holding company of the Indian parent, which holds at least 51% in the Indian company equity, can also guarantee. Any group company of the Indian parent in which the Indian parent holds at least 51%. So when we are talking about giving of guarantees, here the control test which is applicable under Indian Companies Act will apply, and not the control test which is applicable under the ODI regulation. So from an ODI regulation perspective, control we know is 10% now, but if an Indian group company has to give a guarantee for an Indian ODI subsidiary, then the Indian group company will need to have be a 51, at least a 51% subsidiary of the main Indian parent entity. In such cases, we can give a guarantee, guarantees can be given to the overseas lender. Now, if it's a financial guarantee, which means that you simply in the guarantee guaranteeing the repayment of the loan by the foreign entity or the step down subsidiary, then 100% of that financial guarantee is counted towards the financial commitment limit of the Indian entity. If it's a performance guarantee where the Indian parent is, let's say the foreign entity has to show certain construction or has to show certain compliance with certain covenants, then the Indian parent, if it gives only compliance sort of guarantee, in that case that guarantee will constitute 50% of the total financial commitment of the Indian parent. Now another key change that has been made in the ODI regulations, so in the previous regime, let's say Indian parent, holdco, Indian subsidiary 1, all of these were guaranteeing the loans taken by foreign entity, then their financial commitment would be clubbed and the guarantee limit would be calculated against the 400% net worth of Indian parent alone. But now in the new ODI regime, where the Indian parent is giving a guarantee, so the 400% limit will be calculated against net worth of the Indian parent. Where the Indian subsidiary is giving a guarantee or the holdco is giving a guarantee, the net worth will be calculated against their individual limits. It will not be clubbed with the Indian parent. So in some sense what it does, it allows Indian companies to really leverage their balance sheets of multiple group companies. अगर एक छोटी कंपनी है, एक थोड़ी बड़ी कंपनी है, so they can adjust the values accordingly and see where they can actually, how much guarantee they can give for any loan which is being taken by a offshore subsidiary. Pledge on security. So again, going back to the same example, where loans are taken by an offshore foreign entity or a step down subsidiary of the offshore foreign entity, then Indian parent can pledge 100% of its shares in the foreign entity, and the foreign entity can pledge all of its shares in the step down subsidiary in favor of the overseas lender. Indian parent can also pledge its shares in the Indian subsidiary 1 and Indian subsidiary 2 in favor of the overseas lender. That should not be a problem at all. Again, the value of the pledge will be reckoned against the individual financial limits of the entity who owns the asset. It will not be clubbed in one entity. Now in this example, if the Indian parent is also giving a guarantee and is also creating a pledge, then RBI has expressly clarified in these ODI regulations that the limits will not be double counted. So if you've given a guarantee, then the pledge also will not be counted towards the 400% net worth limit of the Indian parent. Now,
the pledge means pledge of shares.
Pledge of shares. The only problem here, which we faced in a recent transaction, was that while the RBI has said that okay, you will not, they've tried to make it convenient for the Indian parent, but operationally what we saw is that the total number, previously operationally it was much easier because there was one form FC, since you were calculating the 400% net worth limit only against one entity. And this is really just very administrative, it's just more paperwork that I'm highlighting here. But in the previous regime, there was one form FC which was filed for all pledges, all charges of all group companies, and there were no questions asked. This time around, what we saw, where Indian parent, Indian sub 1, they're all guarantors, they're all also creating pledges of their respective shares. Then AD banks were actually asking for different forms for each different security for each different entity. So in one of our transactions, because the way RBI is dealing with them, it's one aspect which I really think for the company, for the auditors involved in the company, and even for us as lawyers, we thought it could be one suggestion to the RBI that we really don't need to have multiple forms for each reporting that needs to be done, especially where it's one entity which is creating a pledge on its shares, it's creating a charge on its assets, it's also giving the guarantee. Then we can really reduce the paperwork and streamline the process a bit more. Particularly in transaction closing times, it becomes a major hurdle to sort of figure out the numbers and add the values. So that is one aspect that we thought was something that the regulations could improve on, even though what they've done is really liberalize the regime, clarified the regime, extended the ability of Indian companies to really use their Indian assets to raise funds offshore. Again, for an overseas lending, an Indian parent can create charge on its assets. Indian subsidiaries' assets can also be charged. And if the Indian parent or the Indian subsidiary avails facility from an Indian bank or even issues listed or unlisted debentures in domestic market, then the foreign assets of the foreign entity or the step-down subsidiary and the shares of the foreign subsidiary, foreign entity in the step-down subsidiary can be charged or pledged for an Indian borrowing by the Indian parent or an Indian group company.
Akshita ji, is that for borrowing overseas, you can give corporate guarantee, you can give a pledge of shares,
yes,
you can also create security on the assets of the Indian company.
Yeah.
All the three you can do for borrowing offshore.
Yes.
Right? And similarly, borrowing onshore. Borrowing onshore, can you pledge foreign companies' assets?
Yes, for borrowing onshore, you can now pledge foreign companies. So, in this example, Indian parent has one Indian subsidiary 1, which we've shown only for the purpose of guarantee. Indian parent basically wants to invest in Indian subsidiary 2. Now, one way to do that, Indian parent can use its foreign entity to take loan from an offshore lender. For the foreign entity's loan, Indian parent can pledge the shares of Indian subsidiary 2 and Indian subsidiary 1. It can pledge the shares of foreign entity 1, and foreign entity 1 can pledge the shares of SDS, the step-down subsidiary 1. Okay. Now, foreign entity 1 can use those proceeds to subscribe to CCDs issued by Indian subsidiary 2. The coupon which is serviced on these CCDs can be used by foreign entity 1 to repay to the global lenders.
Service the loan.
Yes, to service the loan. After some point of time, the foreign entity 1 can sell those CCDs back to the Indian parent. So the Indian parent now becomes the holder of CCDs in the Indian subsidiary 2. And the proceeds of that sale of CCDs is used by foreign entity 1 to service the offshore lenders. So what we've done here is basically used the Indian subsidiaries and the foreign entities and the foreign subsidiaries to raise proceeds offshore to actually invest in India. So this is one example of a practical example of round tripping that we were discussing by way of regulation in the last session. So actually I was going to break the norm and keep this presentation short and sweet to just discuss one example of how we can leverage foreign assets for bringing funds back in India. So in this example, what you try to show are two things. How are you one is how are you raising funds from offshore, and secondly, how are you using the restriction which has been done away with on round tripping to bring money back into India. So I think my session was meant to be much shorter than Mr. Bhuta's session, and he had covered most of the aspects. My session was meant to only discuss the financing piece on acquisition finance. So how can offshore entities use financings to acquire Indian entities? So in this one example, I also told you the other example where an offshore entity acquires an Indian parent, where so the offshore entity wanted to acquire an Indian parent. Indian parent can either use its current OPCO of foreign entity 1 or can use an SPV offshore to raise funds and so that the Indian entities and group entities and the foreign entities can charge the assets for the offshore funding. And those offshore loans can then be used by the offshore entity to acquire the Indian parent. Okay, thank you.